What if Cleopatra was actually killed by the Romans? I mean, they knew it would be a huge risk to show her in triumph. They claimed she was a monster. She was so good at spectacle, she might win the Romans over, or at least they would say, well, she doesn't look that scary. And alive in Rome, she could cause all sorts of trouble. When you hear the name Cleopatra, who do you picture? A dazzling, spectacular beauty reclining on cushions? A woman smuggled into Julius Caesar's palace, rolled up in a carpet? Or the dramatic legend of her death from the bite of a poisonous snake? These are the stories we are told about the Egyptian queen who ruled from 51 to 30 BC. But what if they aren't actually true? I'm Professor Kate Williams, and welcome to the second episode of this History Extra Academy series exploring the lives of some of history's greatest queens. In episode 1, we looked at Elizabeth II, the queen of image and television. Well, Cleopatra didn't have television, but she did use the power of the image, so much so that they were destroyed after her death. In this episode, we'll explore the history of Cleopatra, not as a seductress, as she's so often been presented, but as a strategist, a scholar who spoke multiple languages, and a ruler who fought to keep Egypt independent in the face of Roman expansion against impossible odds. Cleopatra is a queen surrounded by myth, so let's start by focusing on what we know is true. At the great temple of Dendera near the Nile, not far from modern-day Luxor in Egypt, Cleopatra is as she wished to be seen. On the back wall of the temple which she so loved is a vast carving of her making offerings to the goddess Hathor. So far, this image is what we might expect from a queen like Cleopatra. But what's most important for me about this image is that she stands behind her son, Caesarion, her child with Julius Caesar. Caesarion is pictured as taller than her, and he wears a greater crown. He was 16 or so when he died, so he never got to rule, and this relief might even have been made when he was a baby or an infant. Here, instead of the monster that the Romans feared, or the sexualized seducer queen that history has depicted, she depicted herself as a supportive mother queen, a divine mother goddess. This is how Cleopatra wished to be viewed, and there were most likely statues like this all across Egypt. And there were no doubt lengthy records of Cleopatra's reign lost in the burning of the library at Alexandria. Arabic sources tell us she was a great scholar, but because the history that survived was by the Romans who hyped up the drama, that's the myth that has taken hold, because they preferred to see the powerful queen of the ancient world, their enemy, as not adept or effective administrator, a bureaucrat who battled for the throne and retained it, described everything, but a siren dancing around men. Cleopatra has been surrounded by myths that we still believe today. I think such is our investment in this fascination with the sexualized version of Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII, the future queen, was born in 69 BC into the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Macedonian royal family who at this point had ruled Egypt for more than 230 years. The Ptolemies, rather problematically for historians, called themselves pretty much all the same name: Ptolemy, Arsinoe, Berenice, or Cleopatra. But this commonality of names did not ensure a commonality of purpose, to put it lightly. The Ptolemies were constantly engaged in bitter blood feuds for power. Brother against sister, especially as brothers and sisters were married, father against son, aunts, nephews, grandmothers, cousins. These were the makings of the worst family weddings in history. And these battles for power were not just contained to the family unit. Rome played a role too. Cleopatra's great-uncle, Ptolemy X, even borrowed money from Rome to fight his brother and mother. And once he borrowed money, and indeed we think made a deal that if he died without an heir, Rome would get Egypt, well, that was the die cast. You've accepted Rome's help, they're going to intervene. And by the time of our Cleopatra, Rome was expanding rapidly across the Mediterranean. Kingdom after kingdom fell under Roman control, and Egypt was increasingly circled by Roman possessions. Cleopatra is often condemned for losing Egypt, but it wasn't her. It was her great-uncle, Ptolemy X. He started it. Cleopatra grew up in a world where family loyalty was fragile and Roman power was growing ever closer. How could she seek to combat such a powerful force? She had some tricks up her sleeve. Cleopatra had been raised as a scholar, tutored in subjects from maths to medicine, and made use of the great library of Alexandria, a centre for learning and scholarship. Whereas earlier Ptolemies had relied on translators, Cleopatra appeared to be the first of her family line to truly learn the Egyptian language. That's something after over 200 years. Even the historian Roman citizen Plutarch admitted that Cleopatra could speak many languages, declaring she spoke to people in their native tongue, around 9 languages. Incredible. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was forced off the throne of Egypt by guess who, his family, when Cleopatra was 11. He fled to Rome to ask for help in regaining power, and Cleopatra, we believe, went with him. During her time there, she was able to observe how Roman politics worked and learn the ways of great men, a young girl in a man's world. Ptolemy eventually paid a Roman general to invade Egypt on his behalf, and he was restored to the throne. By the time Cleopatra was 16, her father knew he was dying, and to secure her future, he staged a joint ceremony, really a coronation ceremony, giving Cleopatra the title father-loving goddess alongside him, and she'd also been accompanying him as a companion in many of his events. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC, Cleopatra became Queen of Egypt, but she was officially co-ruler with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Now, he was only 10, and his advisors, especially one named Pothinus, wanted him as sole monarch, so they initially were co-rulers. And then tensions quickly turned into a power struggle where the woman was supposed to be pushed off for the little boy and his advisors. After 2.5 years of conflict, Cleopatra was forced out of power and Ptolemy XIII thought he got the throne all for himself. Meanwhile, in Rome, Julius Caesar was locked in civil war with the general Pompey, who'd once been his son-in-law before Caesar's daughter Julia had died. When Pompey arrived in Egypt seeking support, the advisors of Cleopatra's brother had him killed. Bad move. It backfired. Caesar was furious. He knew that back in Rome, people would be shocked that Pompey had been executed, and if there was a hint that he had known about it or been involved, he would be in big trouble. So Cleopatra seized her moment and set about her boldest move. She travelled 200 miles, came secretly behind enemy lines, and personally met Caesar in the palace. How did she get there? How did she get to a private meeting with Caesar? Well, to answer that, we have to turn to one of the most famous myths of all. It's one of the most endless and enduring stories about Cleopatra, that she was wrapped up in a carpet, transported by her servant through Julius Caesar's palace, and delivered at his feet. Of course, she then seduced him in a shimmer of Egyptian glamour. The story makes her subservient, sexual, othered, exoticized, whereas, as Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher points out, the Latin words might simply mean she could have been swathed in a cloak. And after all, even if her servant had managed to wrap her up and smuggle her through the palace like an ancient Egyptian removal man, were Caesar's many vigilant guards going to let a random servant carrying a carpet in without questions? I don't think so. It's more likely that, as Joanne Fletcher suggests, Cleopatra was wearing a cloak and she knew the palace. It was her palace. She carried money to bribe the guards to let her through. Because as the whole sexy carpet story was written to obviate, Caesar really needed Cleopatra. He couldn't ally with her brother, Ptolemy XIII, because the Egyptian king's forces had just murdered his former son-in-law. Caesar needed Egyptian support, and so that support was going to have to come from Cleopatra. He would ally with her instead. She was his saviour, not his seducer. The carpet story was written to hide the fact that this was a meeting between two equal superpowers, a summit, rather than a blind date. It's also baffling that we still go on about what a seducer Cleopatra was. She was 21 or 22 at this point, and Caesar was a 52-year-old man who'd had at least 3 wives, who was famed for seducing the wives of his subordinates. I mean, did these ladies have much choice? I don't think so. We don't think that Cleopatra had had any lovers by this point, and yet she's the one cast as this? I think we should rethink about who seduced who. And I often think, was it initially more of a father-daughter relationship? Cleopatra was the same age as Caesar's only child, Julia, had been when she died in childbirth, and certainly she was used to managing her father and some difficult older men, and perhaps it was only once this foundation had been built that their relationship then turned sexual. When Cleopatra became pregnant by Caesar and gave birth to his son Caesarion, it was a political triumph. Her child, and consequently she herself, were now tied to the most powerful man in Rome. She later travelled there with him and seems to have been well received, although apparently she did annoy the statesman Cicero by not rushing to get him a book he wanted from the Library of Alexandria. What else was she but an ancient Egyptian delivery service? The Egyptians knew that this child would be protected. He was Caesar's. If Rome had stayed stable, then Egypt and Cleopatra would have been just fine. Instead, Caesar was assassinated, killed in 44 BC, and his death threw the Roman world, and really the entire ancient world, into chaos once more. After Caesar's death, power was divided between 3 men: Mark Antony, Octavian, Caesar's relation and heir, and another Roman general, Lepidus. Cleopatra now faced another decision that would shape her future. Who should she support? Cleopatra chose Mark Antony, a wise choice. They quickly became a power couple, and Cleopatra bore him twins, Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios. No more Ptolemies! Although actually, Cleopatra would succumb to the tradition and name their 3rd child Ptolemy. In 40 BC, Antony returned to Rome and married Octavian's sister. Now, this has been presented to us by William Shakespeare as a moment that stimulated Cleopatra's angry jealousy. But was it? There's no proof. Cleopatra wanted Rome stable so she could get on with her life and govern her people. What she didn't want was Antony and Octavian fighting again, and I think she hoped that this marriage would make sure they didn't. It's impossible to overstate how much you suffer as a king or queen stalked by the Roman Empire. Whatever you do, you're at the total mercy of Romans falling out with each other. Had Rome stayed stable, Cleopatra would have continued on the throne and handed her realm to her son, Caesarion. Instead, Antony made a failed mission to Parthia and then travelled to Egypt, and Octavian saw his chance and presented Antony as selfishly seduced by an Eastern queen. Cleopatra became the villain in Roman propaganda, depicted as manipulative and dangerous, and his image would endure for centuries. This portrayal wasn't helped by Antony and Cleopatra staging a gigantic ceremony in Alexandria in which they sat on golden thrones, and Caesarion and their 3 children, Alexander, Cleopatra and Ptolemy, were given various parts of the empire. On the coins issued to celebrate the event, Cleopatra was Cleopatra, Queen of Kings, and her sons who are kings. It was just the thing to drive Rome crazy. Caesarion could possibly one day be seen as able to rule not just Egypt, but also Rome, and marry his half-sister Cleopatra Selene, securing an Egyptian dynasty over Rome forevermore. It made him dangerous. It made Cleopatra dangerous. Octavian declared war on Egypt and Cleopatra. He was really declaring it on fellow Roman Antony, but she was the excuse. The sea battle was at Actium in 31 BC, in which Cleopatra left to regroup, and Antony followed her. And then Rome, well, they felt they'd conquered. As part of an attempt to bring peace after Actium, Cleopatra sent Octavian a huge amount of gold. Octavian took the money and told her, well, you can expect favour if you kill Antony or expel him from Egypt. Cleopatra knew the ways of Rome. She guessed that even if she had given in to his request, Octavian would still have invaded. Octavian's forces arrived at the palace, and Cleopatra sequestered herself in a mausoleum. Having injured himself trying to take his own life, Antony came to her and died by her side. She was then seized and imprisoned in her palace by Octavian's men. The story of Cleopatra's death is truly the stuff of legend. Apparently, Cleopatra was so horrified by the idea that she was to be paraded through Rome as a prisoner in a triumph that she killed herself by allowing an asp, an Egyptian cobra, to bite her. Plutarch tells us that the Romans who found her demanded, "Was this well done?" of her maid Charmian, and later she was displayed in the triumph as a trophy of victory, either as a painting or a modelled figure with serpents up her arms. "I saw the arms bitten by sacred serpents," declared Propertius. Writers have talked about serpents ever since. "Where be my serpent of old Nile?" the character of Cleopatra suggests that Antony murmurs in Shakespeare's 1607 play, Antony and Cleopatra. But what if this wasn't the real story? After all, a cobra is far too long to hide in a basket in your room, and snake bites often fail to kill. Even Plutarch fudged the whole snake on the arm story, as I think he knew how many Romans would question the likelihood of snake poison being so swiftly effective, even if you did put a pin in a vein. In fact, there's actually a fresco from the time that shows her with a cup of poison, which is more likely, I might suggest, Cleopatra had long learned about medicine and poisons. The snake was, I'd say, likely a Roman invention, a way to make her death sexual and othering. It undermined the image she actually wanted, a mature, divine mother goddess. The Romans, we might say, wanted everyone to forget about Cleopatra's children and focus on her as seducing Mark Antony. There's another possibility. What if Cleopatra was actually killed by the Romans? I mean, they knew it would be a huge risk to show her in triumph. They claimed she was a monster. She was so good at spectacle, she might win the Romans over, or at least they would say, well, she doesn't look that scary. And alive in Rome, she could cause all sorts of trouble. Cleopatra, as dead, could be monstered, made into an image of lascivious failure, justifying a takeover of her country, and her money could be taken and plunged into Rome. Soon after her death, Caesarion was bumped off, and her sons disappear from the record. Suspicious, right? Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra VII's daughter with Mark Antony, was the only branch of the family tree to survive, and she continued her mother's legacy. She grew up in Rome and eventually ruled Mauritania with her husband, Juba of Numidia, a prince who'd also been brought up in Rome. She spent her life honouring her mother's memory, filling her court with Alexandrian scholars, and even naming her own son Ptolemy. Sadly, after Cleopatra's death, he came to the throne, but he was eventually killed on the orders of Rome in 40 AD, marking the end of the Ptolemies. So, let's add it up. Rome killed Cleopatra's son Caesarion, her grandson Ptolemy, her husband, possibly her other sons, and we think they wouldn't have killed her. We will never know, but just as it looks like that infamous carpet story wasn't true, we can speculate too on the story of her death. But how should we remember Cleopatra? She certainly wasn't the siren that plays and films would have us believe. She was a diplomat, an economist, speaker of many languages, important scholar, and the only ruler who managed to hold off Rome. We should remember Cleopatra for who she was, a great queen.